James, thanks so much for being on the program. And I promise you, we will talk about your book, The Crisis of Dependency, which I just read and I found to be so nourishing. In fact, I would put it on the same bookshelf with Marvin Olasky's The Tragedy of American Compassion and Fickert and Corbett's book on When Helping Hurts, Bob Lupton's book, Toxic Charity. I think you might have mentioned all three of those books in your book at one point or another. And I think this is a worthy addition to that bookshelf. So, congratulations on this book. It's really a fine piece of work.
Well, thanks, Warren, and it's great to be with you today and to talk about that and some other things.
Yeah, in fact, I want to start with some of the other things because I know that this book, The Crisis of Dependency, is informed by many years of experience that you have had working, founding Watered Gardens and the True Charity Network. As I think you know, you might remember, I was at the True Charity Network meeting that you guys had last year. Was super impressed by that, and Lord willing, I'll be at the meeting again coming up in just a couple of months. Just really marveled at the ministries that you had there and the quality of the work and what was happening there. But I know even that began with Watered Gardens. Can you take us all the way back to the beginning of your work in this arena with Watered Gardens, some of the things you did right and some of the things that you did wrong in the beginning, and how you've really had a major change in ministry emphasis as a result of those experiences?
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, we're going back quite a time frame. It's been 25 years now since my wife and I co-founded our ministry, Watered Gardens Ministries. It comes out of Isaiah chapter 58, where God's making a beautiful promise to his people that if we will uh, shelter the poor, clothe the naked, feed the hungry. If we extend ourselves, Isaiah 58:10 says, if we'll extend ourselves, our lives to people who are in need, that we'll be like a watered garden and like a spring whose waters never fail. So a beautiful promise. And the mission got started, I think, like a lot of nonprofits or a lot of ministries do, Warren. It's compassion for people around you that causes you to launch a work like that. And certainly that's exactly what happened. Our hearts were ignited with compassion for people. We saw issues of poverty. At the time, I was practicing physical therapy, but we wanted to start this ministry, and so we did. It was a volunteer-led small mission for a number of years, and compassion drove the activity forward. And this is very common. Compassion is what the emotion that gives way to action, which we call charity. And what we found is that charity can be the source of charity can be very true, but the outcome of charity can be effective or sometimes ineffective, sometimes maybe even harmful. And we were guilty of that in our earlier years. We were basically a redistribution center. We saw a need. We wanted people to come. We wanted to help meet a need. And whatever need was vocalized was the one we try to meet. And we ended up meeting a lot of superficial needs. There were a lot of material needs that were being met through our ministry, but we were not seeing the outcomes that we had hoped to see in people's lives.
And if I could interrupt you, what you mean by that, at least in part, James, is that you were seeing the same people over and over again. You were seeing the same people who, were just not being helped in spite of all of the help that you were providing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we were seeing the same thousands of people through our doors regularly who became dependent on us in what I believe to be an unhealthy way. And when we began to turn our ministry, and I know you're interested in that evolution of how that happened, uh, and I think it was just the desire to really want to do good, to really help people, forced us to reckon with the fact that our charity was not doing the good that we wanted it to do. We needed to change something, and we did a number of different things. One was just connecting our community with an online tool so we could share information with other like-minded organizations, so that we could operate more cohesively as a unit and just work together more collaboratively in our community. That was one thing. But the other thing we did is we started our worth shop. we call it a worth shop because we believe that work awakens worth in people's lives. And um, we went through a few different things that were very pivotal points in our ministry that caused us to rethink how we were doing charity. And primarily, if we wanted to boil it down, is we were coming into a fuller understanding of Imago Dei, the idea of man being made in the image of God, and therefore he's made in the image of a creator or a producer, and is intended to create and produce. And that if our charity is somehow drowning that drive to produce out, we're doing more of a disservice and a harm than we are good. So we started this worth shop where people now earn the very basics that they need. I think last year almost 30,000 basic needs were earned by people. And this is food, shelter, clothing, and the like. Folks who have capacity to contribute, being called toward contribution and being able to earn what they need. And so we began to make these changes. We also became much more goal oriented, more investigative in our charity, sitting down with people and not just smiling, handing them whatever and praying for them on their way out the door, but really digging into what's going on in life. Where are your family? What's your history been? What do you want to do with the future? What are the steps and the goals that we can set for you to get there? All of these kinds of good investigative charity types of things we began to do. But when we did, we had thousands of people who no longer came through our doors.
Right.
So there were like 4,000 folks every year coming through our doors, many of the same people. And when we changed our model to something that was more developmental and less relief based, we had somewhere around 2,800 people or so that just weren't coming through our doors any longer. And that, Warren, that is when we were like, oh my gosh, how sad that these folks have obviously gone somewhere else where they're able to remain dependent in an unhealthy way. And we knew we needed to begin to influence the minds and hearts of people in our community about how to view the human person, what to think about charity, how do we define poverty. And that was the birth of True Charity as a local initiative in 2012. And then in 2020, we launched a national network that has grown to expand across 32 states and includes about 220 churches and nonprofits today. And so that's kind of the evolution.
Yeah, yeah. And so, in fact, I was going to ask you how many were in the True Charity Network. I believe when I was at the meeting, the annual conference last year, y'all were welcoming your 200th member, and it sounds like now you've got 220 members, so you're continuing to grow. And one of the things that impressed me was that the members of the True Charity Network have really made a radical commitment to some of the principles that you guys have articulated over the last few years. In other words, not only are you uh, trying to live by these principles, but you've codified them, you've created a curriculum for them, you're transferring them to these other ministries, and these ministries, to become a part of the True Charity Network, have to really commit to those principles. I mean, this really sounds like a charity revolution in some ways. Is that what you envision? What you
I,
hope for?
I like that term, charity revolution. I often say we're endeavoring to transform the way that charity is practiced in the United States. And I do believe that we went from the Great Depression into the Great Dependency, where there was much need for relief in the 1930s. And I don't think we ever got out of the relief business. And I think we need to get out of it. And it's not to say there aren't times when a hurricane will sweep through Florida, or there might be a tornado that comes through a city where relief is not needed. Maybe it's even a house fire where a family needs immediate relief, which is a one-way transactional charity. But that should be very short-lived, and it should be less common than what it is today. If we're really going to help people struggling in chronic poverty, we have to shift our thoughts more toward rehabilitation and development. And yeah, we're wanting to. And the thing is that it's unfortunate, in my opinion, that the word charity has been relegated to the idea of a handout, to the idea of aid or relief. And I think we need to redefine that. In fact, I was sitting down with a couple not that long ago, ministry leaders, and they were struggling with the ideas of true charity. And he said, James, in the Bible, it just looks like we're supposed to give. We're just supposed to give. And I said, well, we are supposed to give. The question is, what do we give? Do we give relief? Do we give rehabilitation? Or do we give development? We do need to give, but what is the right kind of charity that's actually going to help people escape the trap of poverty? And that was a real eye opener for this particular person when we were meeting. And I think it's a great framework. We need to be thinking about that. Charity is not just one way handout relief. It can be rehabilitation or development. Three different forms of charity that Pickard and Corbett spelled out well in their book, When Helping Hurts.
Yeah. Well, now we're starting to transition a little bit into the book itself, from that history into some of the ideas in your book, and let's just stipulate for the record that this is we're not going to be able to cover everything that you talk about in your book, James, but there are a few ideas. Some of them you have already mentioned, a few others that I'd like to introduce, just to get you to unpack and say a little bit more about. One is this: you used an expression earlier that I want to make sure that we don't gloss over, that we don't forget that, and that is this idea that work awakens worth. And you call your workshop actually a worth shop for that very reason. You mentioned the Imago Dei, the fact that God is a creator, that God is a maker, that God is a doer, and that therefore, if we're made in His image, we should do the same. That not only should we do the same because it's in our DNA, we want to do the same, but it also it creates dignity, it creates worth when we do so. Can you talk a little bit more about how y'all made that transition from people just taking handouts to actually having to, or I should say, getting to work for the benefits that they receive? Was that did y'all just flip a switch one day, or did that take place gradually over a period of time?
That's a great question. I mean, I think for any ministry leader listening to the podcast today, they'd want to know, how in the world do you actually do that? And it was a difficult moment in our ministry because we wondered what would happen as a result when we did flip the switch. Was anybody going to be coming through our doors anymore? And what we did is there were, again, a lot of people coming through on a daily basis, and many of them would be folks that we knew very well. And we just began to let them know. We even posted some signs, Warren, around the ministry. And there was kind of a countdown over a month's time period where people knew that the day was coming when we were going to shift away from just repetitive handouts. And so it was very clearly communicated to our community that things were going to change. And what's really interesting about that, I haven't thought about this for quite some time, but what's interesting about that story is when we had come to that point, the decision had been made that we would no longer give people something repetitively 5 times in a row. We would only give it 4 times in a row. And here's why. Because we had read Robert Lupton's book, Toxic Charity, in
Yeah.
which he talks about, you give something to somebody once, they'll appreciate it. But if you give the same thing to that person again, they'll have an anticipation it's coming a third time. If you give it a third time, they'll feel an expectation that it will come a fourth. If you give it a fourth time, they'll feel entitled to it. And a fifth time, they'll be dependent on you for it. So appreciation, anticipation, expectation, entitlement, dependency. So we read the book. We thought, yes, we're guilty of this. We need to change this. And when we did our countdown to that time, we said, we're no longer going to give 5 times in a row. Well, it wasn't long after that we thought, why are we doing this? We should cut this down to like 3 times. And we did. And then we just shrugged our shoulders after a few more months. We were like, why are we doing this? Let's just ask people to be a participant in their journey out of poverty by engaging them as people with capacity and value and inherent worth, most easily conveyed through work. And it is what we produce and what we do with our lives that creates a sense of value. I mean, we have inherent value as being God's special creation, but the expression of that value is incredibly important for human dignity. And so we just began to ask people right off the bat. And now, for many years, that's exactly what we've done. Folks come in, they might get a night of shelter. They might get a meal, but immediately after that, they begin partnering for some of those basics in our worth shop.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you talk about in your book is the idea that, and you mentioned this, that during the Great Depression, these massive social programs grew up. In fact, they didn't always start out massive, but they became massive over time, certainly, and some of them started out pretty big in the beginning. And you say that those programs have tended to crowd out true charity. Can you see if, again, we're kind of skipping around in terms of the concepts in the book, and we're leaving out a lot, James, but this one was really hit me. Can you say more about this crowding out of charity, that whenever you just keep giving away free stuff, that you actually discourage people who are willing and able to work to actually work? Is that right?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, it works on a couple of levels. I mean, first of all, when you have government, federal government especially, reaching in to help neighbors in your community who are struggling in poverty, there's just less of a tendency for you to notice there's a need. There's less of an impetus or drive for you to do something about a need that's not really being expressed to you because it's being met elsewhere. And so your charity is being crowded out. But and as I mentioned in the book, the bad thing about crowd out is it's unseen. And so you don't, because it's not seen, it's often out of mind. You're not thinking about it. And it's very hard for us to measure how much is actually being crowded out because we have government programs that are doing the work that really local churches, civic organizations, and compassionate neighbors ought to be doing. And it's very hard to say. But yeah, I think that it's very true. And I give some examples in the book of different ways that I've seen the private sector crowd back in when the state has stepped out. And that's what really alerts me to the truth that, yeah, there's a lot that's being crowded out. It's an economic term, when it deals with public sector stepping in and it crowds out private sector contribution or involvement. And I think that it fits very well in our talk about charity. And if your charity is effective, which would be encouraging people to go to work, then it's even worse because it's crowding out charity that would actually help people escape poverty.
Yeah, yeah. And you gave some examples that I found to be meaningful. I live in Western North Carolina, live in Charlotte, which is not exactly where Hurricane Helene hit. We had some very minimal effects here. But one of the things that we witnessed, and I know you witnessed whenever a terrible tornado hit Joplin, Missouri, which is your hometown, is that it was neighbor helping neighbor, which provided the most immediate relief. Yes, there was a need or a role for the federal government, for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Authority, to step in. But one of the things that you pointed out and that I witnessed here recently was that um, FEMA is not as agile as the person that lives next door to you in terms of meeting an immediate need. And just that alone, I think, should be a really important lesson for us, right?
Right. Not only are they not as agile, but they're also not as knowledgeable. They're not in the know of what's really going on with your neighbor in need as much as people who live around that person. And so that's another reason why we need to reorient this and think about how local community, church involvement, private sector ought to be the first who are helping those struggling in poverty before we see far removed sources of help like federal government being involved. We need to layer that
Yeah.
correctly.
So not only does the federal government tend to crowd out local charity, there's another unintended but very, very real consequence that you talk about in your book that I would like for you to talk a little bit about here, James, and that is the idea of a benefits cliff. So once the local, faith-based or community-based, church-based aid has been crowded out, then the federal government and the state government and other layers of government start piling up these benefits. And so you end up over time with this huge amount of benefit that if people went back to work, they would lose. And you've identified that, and I've heard this described elsewhere as the benefits cliff. And can you say more about the benefits cliff, why it's
Sure.
so nefarious, if I could put it that way, and how it is that the kind of true charity that you're doing through Watered Gardens and the folks in the True Charity Network are trying to counter and work against?
Yeah, well, it's benefits cliff, also sometimes called the welfare cliff. But when you, yeah, for listeners who may not be very familiar with how that works, when you begin to stack benefits like child tax credit, LIHEAP energy assistance, food stamp program, housing assistance, Medicaid. I mean, when you start to stack all of the benefits up, it's quite sizable. A single parent with a couple of kids in most states making say 25, 30,000 a year could have up to $50,000 or so more of those benefits added on, bringing an equivalency of about $80,000 of income, you might say, for lack of a better term. But what happens when that parent advances at work to where they're making 40,000 a year? Maybe there's a raise or an opportunity to make more per year at their job. Well, suddenly the benefits drop off. I'm no longer eligible for maybe a handful of the 7 or 8 or more of these government programs, bringing your total income into the household less than what it was when you were making 20 or 25,000 a year. So why take a promotion? Why do I want to advance? And I've heard real testimonies from people who have intentionally held back from that because they don't want to lose those benefits that they're on. Now, I think the way that we need to start thinking about this. For example, there are folks out there right now in the policy space who are very aware of the problem of the welfare or the benefits cliff. And one of the solutions uh, that they're bringing forward is to inflate the benefits at that point where the cliff happens, where they all tend to drop off. Inflate those so that it's a ramp rather than a cliff. And what I find sad about that is nobody's thinking about what could the private sector do there? Instead of it, again, it being more benefits to create a ramp instead of a cliff, what about the private sector stepping in and helping fill that as that parent moves into a better job, but is going to be a little bit more in need of some food or some other things like that, where maybe we could step in and actually help fill that gap, help fill that cliff as that person takes that step. I think we just need to be thinking about that, and all too often we look to government to be the provider of solutions rather than looking at civil society as the main contender.
Yeah, I hear that loud and clear, James, and I 100% agree with you. But I am daunted by the prospect of change in this arena because these are benefits that have been stacking up over 60, 70, 80 years now, and it seems to me a real challenge to figure out, what the right answer is. I mean, and it also creates some perverse social incentives as well. You mentioned that single mom with 2 children receiving all of these benefits. Well, just the act of that single mom getting married might cause that woman to lose a lot of those benefits. And of course, as Christians, we want, to encourage intact families. This is a public policy that in fact discourages the formation of intact families, fathers and mothers living together, raising their own children, which we know, and you actually had a chart in your book that talked about just the how the outcomes for children are so much better whenever mothers and fathers are living together. And yet we've got these public policies that are actively, perversely, I would say, incentivizing folks not to do that. So given all of
Yeah.
that, and I know you and I could probably rant for a week just on that issue alone, James Whitford is king of the world and he can do one thing. to help solve this problem. Is that possible? I mean, is it a one thing that we should do, or is it just going to be, it took us 80 years to get here and it's going to take us 50 years to get out of here?
Yeah, I don't think there's one thing that we can do, but the first thing that comes to mind for me as you say that, and I don't think about that kind of thing very often, but I think immediately of the pulpits of our churches, and how important the gospel is, and because in order to really bring this to fix this, and I talk about this in the book as well, but
Yep.
we have a lot of people who want to solve the problems of poverty or solve the problems of homelessness, but don't necessarily want to be with someone who's struggling in poverty or homelessness. And that is a thing of the heart. That requires conviction of the Holy Spirit to say, I want to do something to help my fellow man in a relational way. And we really do need to see our pendulum shift from wanting to solve problems to wanting to be with people and really help people. And I
Mm.
think that's the number one thing as far as from the heart that we can do. From a policy standpoint or a charity practice standpoint, I would come to that idea of subsidiarity, which I also discuss. And it is what you and I have already talked about, which is layering things correctly from what can the individual do for him or herself before we jump in and be the paternalistic rescuer? And then what can the family do that might be involved before we jump in and disrupt the natural ties that exist in families and communities? And then what can civic organizations or churches do? And then maybe state and federal government. So there's that concentric layering, starting with the person. And the more that we mix that up or reverse that, I think the further we will be from any real solution. So we need to see subsidiarity practiced in our charity as well as in our policy. And from a policy perspective, Warren, what that means is that we need to uh, reduce the ease of people accessing federal help before they've exhausted local private help. And that means maybe work requirements for welfare, and maybe it's, reducing right now, I think at 130% poverty level, you're eligible for all sorts of programs. Maybe we reduce that. It's basically lifting welfare up and out of the picture a little bit so that there's more of a drive for the local community to be involved, and people would tend to turn there first. So that's some of the stuff that could be done from the policy
Yeah.
perspective.
James, I'd like to pivot in our conversation a little bit as we try to land this airplane. Again, stipulating for the record that there's no way we're going to be able to cover everything that's in your book. And by the way, we're going to be offering your book as a premium to donors to Ministry Watch during the month of February, and I'm really excited about that, and putting this book in the hands of some of you who are listening today. But that does cause me to ask this question, James, because the mission of Ministry Watch is to help donors be more effective stewards of the resources God has entrusted to them. That is literally our mission statement. So speak to donors for just a minute. I'm a donor. I want to help. I've got financial resources. I've been giving money to this ministry for 30 years, $10 a month or $50 a month, or, every year Thanksgiving comes around and they say I can feed 100 kids, 100 men at their shelter if I write them a check for $140 or whatever it is. So I do that. Is that the best way to do charity? I mean, if I've read your book and I've heard this podcast, and I'm like, you know what? Not only do we need more effective ministries out there, but we need more effective donors out there empowering these ministries. What kind of questions should the donors be asking of the ministries they're supporting?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think that the first thing to understand, well, hopefully by now your listeners are in agreement that there can be a toxic form of charity that creates dependency and does more harm than good, and there can be a true, more effective kind of charity that really empowers people, and then we're left to wrestle with my funding, my donations are either advancing one or the other or something in between. And how do you know? And so there are some good questions to ask. I think a great one is, if I'm talking to a charity I support, a leader, I want to say, are you receiving any resource that is restricting you from practicing investigative, healthy charity where you can set goals with people and that type of thing? Because there are many ministries and organizations that do receive either funding or sometimes it's food resource, and the hands are tied. They're told that they can only give it away with no questions asked. And I think donors need to understand, are the ministries they're supporting able and free to practice effective charity, or are their hands tied because of some resource that they're receiving? I think another good question is, what are you measuring? I mean, I see on your website that you're, serving so many people and you're giving away so much food, but what else are you measuring that would be a metric of people escaping poverty? And can you show me that? I think that's a great question for a donor. Let me see some of that measurement that you're doing. And
If I could interrupt you there, James, just real quickly, I bet that was a hard pivot for you guys because it's easy to say we fed 10,000 people this week, and
it,
that number is a big number, right? But then when you replace that, when you're talking to your donors and you say we fed 10,000 people this week, they say, "Oh wow!" But if you say we helped 10 people actually transform their lives, 10 people over the course of the last year actually came off of welfare and are fully, self-sustaining human beings. I mean, that's great, but that ain't 10,000. That's 10. I mean,
you're right. It's 10, but are the 10,000 going to be back next year also?
yeah.
And so
So there
the
isn't. My point is, there really is an education process that you have to go
yes,
through, donors and
yeah,
all constituencies, right?
absolutely. And you also have to think that those 10 individuals who came off of welfare, maybe they came out of homelessness where they were using emergency room services, or maybe, different public services that tally up well over, for a chronically homeless individual, well over $50,000 a year.
Yeah.
So it's not just 10 individuals; those are dollars as well that are now, they're now contributors rather than takers, and so that has a value to it that needs to be remembered. The other question to ask is, what are you doing that that requires something of the individual? What are you requiring of the people that you're helping? Are you asking for anything from them in return? Or are you just treating them as charity cases? So I think that's a great question. And hopefully it would, the response is going to be, well, we're writing goals and we're holding people accountable to goals, or we've got an earn up model or a worth shopper. They're helping with chores, but we need to make sure that charities and missions and ministries are not treating people as mere recipients of our benevolence, but are engaging them as subjects who have autonomy and agency and capacity to work their way out of poverty. Because the truth be told, there's not enough aid that you're going to dump on a person or in a nation that will lift that person or nation out of poverty. It is something that has to happen from within. And that's not to say there's not a need for grace and relationship and love and nurturing and encouragement. It's all needed. But ultimately, they will be the ones who are walking themselves out of poverty. We just walk alongside them. We cannot give enough charity to lift a person out of poverty.
James, that's a good word to close on. Thank you so much for your work at Watered Gardens and the True Charity Network. I've seen at least the True Charity Network up close and personal myself. We've written about it here at Ministry Watch, and we'll have links to some of the articles that we've done in the show notes for today's program. In the meantime, I sure hope you will go check out James's work. And yeah, it's been, as I said at the beginning, James, I'm really impressed with this book. Really impressed with the work that you're doing. I think that that it's really, really special. I would even say unique in this country. I know there are others that are catching the vision, in part thanks to the True Charity Network, but I just really want to commend you and thank you for being on the program and sharing a little bit of your story today.
Yeah, thanks, Warren. It's great to be with you today. And Yeah, I'm hopeful we'll continue to grow the movement, and we're just one voice of many, but it's an important voice to be heard in our nation today. And anybody who's listening can learn more about us at truecharity.us, or the book website landing page is thecrisisofdependency.com.
Great. Excellent. James, blessings to you. May your tribe increase. Have a great
Thank
day.
you. Thank you, sir.